Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and today we're going to explore the psychological benefits and challenges of living vegan with author Angela Crawford. Listening to this interview, I was reflecting on my own mental state lately and how the political situation of the moment is affecting me now, about 5 months into the second Trump era. And I've been lucky to have the distraction of organizing the first ever Eugene Vegan Fest the first half of this year, which happened a few weeks ago, and it was amazing, by the way. It was incredible. We had 1,500 people show up for this first ever event. I mean, it was incredible. We were overrun. There were so many people there. We had about 40 volunteers who were helping and so excited. The community just really stepped up with a huge turnout. So that was thrilling and heartwarming and relieving. Of course, it took over my life for months. That's how these large scale events are. And I just can't come up for air. But now that the dust has settled, I find myself able to reflect on the reality of what we are living in the US. There's an extensive list of horrible things that Trump is doing and trying to do. And I haven't talked about it really much on the podcast, and I'm not going to get in too deep here. We will get into the interview soon, but I felt like I really wanted to acknowledge it. I have a platform here, and we can't be silent about what's happening. And top of my mind, I mean, there's just way too much craziness to cover and think about. But top of my mind are the attacks on the trans community, this very vulnerable community that needs our understanding and love and protection. And to see what's happening with that is just breaking my heart. Also, immigrants. I mean, the demonization of the immigrant community who are fleeing violence and hunger and gangs and horrible situations. Again, a community that needs our protection and love. It's just so unkind and cruel what's happening in this country. Then to think of the planet and the wildlife and the climate crisis and Trump's rollback of regulations and blatant disregard for the environment. I mean, this issue should really be our concern right now. I mean, like top concern, just for the urgency of our inability to rectify the damage, the worse it gets. And it isn't even on the radar. Then all the cuts to government. I think that people who wanted these cuts, right? I understand wanting to weed out inefficiency and any misconduct, sure. But just shutting it all down, that's not the answer. I don't think that people fully understood what government does and what government is. It's people. It's people helping the planet, dedicated, smart people who are using our tax dollars for good things, like finding the cure for cancer or feeding starving people or helping people with healthcare that can't afford it or cleaning up the environment. I mean, so many good things that we should be proud of and proud to do. It's breaking my heart to see all this being dismantled. And, all of this, it can really feel disempowering. I feel so out of control and like there is just no way to help or to stop it. But then I realize that, I do have some power. We do have some power on an individual level to counter the cruelty. A friend of mine just reminded me in an email that this all is really a reaction to the trajectory that we were on, the good trajectory that we were on. She wrote, in these horribly disturbing times when a lot of negative values are erupting like a volcano, I think it is in direct response to the advances that we were making. So we have to keep going. We have to keep pushing forward. I've dedicated myself to nonprofit work, to spreading kindness and compassion through veganism. And I believe that we have to change who we are as a society, not just what we do. We need to change what we care about, who we prioritize, what we consider sacred, what we have reverence for. And that is not money and power, right? No, it should be all life on this planet. That's what we need to prioritize and find sacred. And that is what vegan stands for. As vegans, we're kind of already equipped for standing up to a powerful negative ideology, right? We know what generational work looks like, and that the seeds we plant may not grow for years or decades, but we must persist and continue to speak up for kindness, to vote for compassion, and do the work on an individual level, on a community level, on a grassroots level. And now that I have a bit more time, I do want to find some of my local protests to reach beyond my vegan work and make my voice heard in opposition to what's happening. I hope you can find something that helps you to offset that feeling of disempowerment. Let the work empower you. Let your volunteerism empower you. Let your veganism empower you. Know that whatever you're doing to bring compassion and love into this world is countering the cruelty. All right, so let's transition into talking about Angela Crawford's Vegan Transformation book. And her book, as well as my book, The Humane Hoax, are both published by Lantern Publishing and Media. Lantern is one of the only publishers focused on animals and veganism and social justice, and just an awesome selection of books. Let's hear a little about Lantern's podcast, and then we'll have our conversation with Angela on the other side.
Hello, everyone. I am Louisa, one of the hosts of Lantern Voices, a new podcast by Lantern Publishing and Media. Lantern Publishing and Media is a nonprofit book publisher. Our mission is to publish books that promote a better, more compassionate world for all animals. We are the proud publishers of The Humane Hoax by Hope Bohanec, Sister Vegan by Breeze Harper, How to End Injustice Everywhere by Melanie Joy, among many other authors that develop amazing works on behalf of our planet and non-human animals. Join us every other week for interviews with our authors, activists, and people that are fighting for a more compassionate world. Follow Lantern Voices at your favorite podcast platform and keep up with the latest news about our podcasts and our books by following Lantern PM on Instagram.
All right, everybody, I am excited to bring in our guest today. Today we have Angela Crawford. She is a psychologist, a vegan educator, and author of The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. She holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and previously worked as a psychotherapist for 25 years, empowering clients towards greater holistic well-being. She is certified as a master vegan lifestyle coach and educator, and also licensed as a PCRM Food for Life instructor and transformational coach. Please welcome Angela Crawford.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you. We met for the first time, I think, at the Albuquerque Veg Fest where we were both speaking. Was that the first time we've met?
Yes, that was, but it was wonderful. And we quickly realized we were both Lantern authors, or I was going to be one.
Yeah, absolutely. My book had just come out and yours was coming out and is now out. And I was like, you got to be on my podcast. So I want to get into your book, and that's the main thing we're going to talk about today. But we love to get to know you with an opening question of why and when you went vegan.
And I love answering that question. I learn more every time I try to reflect on it. So it's a really interesting question. For me, it started first with becoming vegetarian, which I think, there's a fair number of us that comes first. I had never considered being vegetarian or vegan before. I knew a few vegetarians and maybe had met one vegan, and I always just thought, how do they eat this way? I just couldn't understand what they ate or how they did it. I always had challenges with my eating patterns and didn't eat very healthy and just ate what was convenient. And I didn't fully understand about vegetarianism or veganism, but I happened to see a program on PBS that showed a segment about workers in a meat processing plant. And I believe it was in North Carolina, and many of the workers were immigrants, and many of them had felt they had limited financial options and were having these frequent injuries because of the nature of the work they were doing. But yet they were being pressured by their employer to keep working and to not report their injuries or seek treatment, or they might be at risk of losing their job. And it didn't show any gory details. It didn't really show much about their actual work, but just the little bit that I saw got me thinking about the food that I eat and the whole process by which it comes to me, and in particular, animal agriculture. And I just had this thought that night that it seemed unjust. And I worked with injured workers in my work as a psychologist at the time, not people from that industry, but other types of work injuries. And so I had a certain compassion for what people go through when they have injuries or unjust working situations. As I thought about all that, I very quickly came to think, well, if I don't like how the workers are treated in this situation, what do I think about what happens with the animals? And
Mm.
that was a question that I was holding. And it led me to the very next day to buy a vegetarian cookbook to make a lasagna, which, I was not a cook and had to buy pots and pans even as I was making the recipe.
Wow.
Yeah, but something had sparked in me where I went from someone who I can't bother to cook to I'm determined to figure this out. And I began buying all kinds of, or reading all kinds of books that had to do with everything from the ethics of vegetarian and vegan lifestyles to more of the health and nutrition aspects because I wanted to do it right, quote unquote. I wanted to make sure I was covering my nutritional bases so that it would really work for me. And so I became vegetarian first. And I wish it was quicker, but it took me several years to commit to being fully vegan. I think it was a path of inner growth that I was doing in my own life. I'd started a transformational coaching program. I was working as a psychotherapist, so I was always into sort of growth and learning. But in this transformational coaching program, I was working on myself as well and realizing some patterns where I had not thought of myself as a people pleaser, but there were times where I wasn't being true to myself in the sake of harmony and fitting in. And I was looking at those patterns. And I think that led me to look at veganism and to really realize here's an area where I'm not fully in alignment. I think I know enough to know that egg-laying hens and dairy cows, their conditions of living are horrific as well. And if I'm vegetarian for the animals, why not become vegan?
Yeah.
So that led me to then commit to the vegan lifestyle in early 2019 and everything that's evolved since then.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Interesting things there. First of all, I love that not only did you buy a vegetarian cookbook or a vegan cookbook, but also pots and pans like that. And I think that you find that this lifestyle can encourage people to start cooking more, learning more about their food, shopping at grocery stores more, and that's all good. Those are all good things for our health, for the planet, all of that. So that's really cool. And the other thing that was interesting to me in your story was that your initial introduction was through this PBS special about the workers. And that's just so interesting and beautiful to me because we forget that humans are so affected by all of this too, that there are humans that are suffering as well in these places that are forced to do this horrible work. And that made you think further about, well, what about the animals too? And we're just now learning that PBS and other and NPR as well are losing funding because of the government cuts that are happening right now. And I think when I heard that, it was just so tragic. It was so scary to me because NPR, PBS, these are such important informational and educational outlets that we're losing. Anyway, I had a lot of thoughts on your.
Yeah, well, I relate to what you're saying totally.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree with you about the concerns about the funding cuts because certainly PBS and NPR have helped me and so many others learn so much and have access to so much information. So I'm definitely with you on the concerns about that.
Yeah, yeah, lots of concerns going on right now. But so you have written this wonderful book called The Vegan Transformation: A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. And I have been looking through the book and really enjoying it. And this book is, it's not only about transforming or transformation that we have physically and how much healthier we can be eating vegan, which it certainly has that aspect, but also, and maybe more so, it's about how so many vegans feel just more empowered, at peace. I actually have a quote here from the book. You said that so many vegans reported more peace and well-being, spiritual growth, and or a compelling sense of purpose and contribution. So tell us about this. Tell us why you wanted to write this book.
Well, when I became vegan, I personally had, I'd say, a deep transformation. Vegetarian was very impactful for me. That was a stance of compassion for me. But when I became vegan, it went deeper. There was a greater commitment that was required of me to handle social situations and my own disconnect. So there was something awakened in me when I became vegan that went deeper than even the vegetarian path. And so I saw things like me becoming more true to myself, being willing to figure out how to handle the situations that had seemed like a block to me, and many of those were social situations, or how to find more cruelty-free items in all sectors of my life. This was a discovery process that something shifted. I became willing to take it on because I realized that my commitment to this was greater than any challenges that I might face in learning these new things to make this a part of my life. And so all these things happened inside of me as I went on this path. I became willing to speak up more. I felt more at peace. Again, something that came up with a lot of the people I interviewed is that, they hadn't realized that there was this weight on them of not living in alignment with certain values that is lifted, once you embrace veganism. So I felt that shift in me and a deeper sense of purpose, that something so simple in a way that in changing what I ate or what I purchased and different mindsets could have such an impact on so many things I cared about, the animals being the foundational piece, but finding that it was interconnected with the environment and health and other things like food security. All of that just felt so deeply meaningful to me that I wanted to share it with other people. And it went beyond like a personal choice, which I think vegetarian felt more like this is my personal ethical choice. This felt bigger, being vegan, that it could influence the things I cared about in a much deeper way.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to share it. And as a psychologist, the things that interested me were more the psychosocial and spiritual aspects, which I felt there wasn't as much coverage of in the books that I had read. And as I met other vegans who had similar experiences that were, on LinkedIn, all these vegans are in different businesses or volunteer positions or advocacy. So many vegans were expressing purpose through their vegan lifestyle and values. And so I felt this was important to study more. And I also wanted to reach people in my life who were, I'll call them pre-vegan, compassionate people, spiritual people, but had not made this connection, and wanted to show the positives of this lifestyle as well, that it's not just depriving or giving things up, as sometimes people believe, but it's empowering and fulfilling in ways that sometimes we don't consider. So that's really what led me to want to do the research and start the survey and interviews that led to the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you did this research of hundreds of vegans, like a survey that you gave to hundreds of vegans about kind of the emotional and social benefits of living vegan. So tell us about that. What were some of the core themes that emerged in your research? And I think that you devoted each chapter of the book to these themes that emerged through the research. So what's maybe a synopsis of those themes, or what did you find?
Sure. So the survey that I gave out had maybe 10, 11 questions where people responded both to checkbox questions as well as open-ended questions with their own words. And I was looking at, as you were mentioning, the social, spiritual, and emotional, psychological impacts that vegans were reporting from their lifestyle. And primarily the benefits, but also the challenges and how they, dealt with any challenges. And so from that, 7 core themes, I, later coded the data, looked at how different things fit in different categories. And there were 7 core themes that came through as the most prominent, the most common. So just to briefly mention them, the foundational theme was values alignment, which isn't surprising, but maybe what surprised me about it was how impactful it was for people, because I feel like in our culture, we don't talk a lot about values and how important our values are in guiding us in our choices and living a life of meaning. And how when we don't feel at peace with something, sometimes it's because something's not in sync with our values. So that really came through with people's responses, where I'd say 85% or more said that it was a major positive for them of this lifestyle, that they now felt they were living more in alignment with their core values.
Mm.
And yeah, and so many, when you read the chapter on the values, I share several quotes about it, people's personal experience that, like I mentioned, a weight is lifted. It connects the dots for me on so many things I care about. Just all these different ways that it was deeply peaceful and meaningful for people to realize that they could make a choice through their eating and other purchases and actions that actually was so aligned with things they'd always cared about.
Yeah.
So that seemed to me like the foundational shift that led to the other ones. So compassion, not surprising, but expanding our circle of compassion, that was another very commonly expressed positive that people reported. And even those that started for more health reasons rather than ethical reasons said that their compassion had been opened since they stopped eating animals, that they
Yeah.
now saw things differently.
Yeah.
Then there was meaning and purpose, a greater sense of meaning and a sense of purpose, including what I'd mentioned earlier, this, often creating volunteer or even businesses type of work around their vegan values and lifestyle.
Yeah.
Authentic fulfillment, which was this sense of personal fulfillment that doesn't mean necessarily being happy all the time, but rather navigating a lot of emotions that we might have that can be positive emotions and more challenging emotions. But through that all, there's this deeper fulfillment that fits with living with your values, aligned with your values. And so there was this sense of personal fulfillment. And for some too, there was even improvement in things like mental health. And that wasn't for everybody, but there were several that reported shifts, especially if they were eating a healthier version of a vegan diet, that seemed to also happen. There was a sense of connection with like-hearted people, a tribe of others who share your values that was deeply meaningful for many people.
Mm.
There was health empowerment. Again, people became vegan for different reasons, but even some that were more vegan, again, for the ethical reasons, still sometimes had physical healings that were unexpected. And then the final one was this sense of interconnectedness, a spiritual deepening. And again, whether someone identified as spiritual or not, the themes that came up in this were often what we would often call spiritual, like I feel interconnected with all of life and nature in a way that I hadn't fully felt before. So once we're leaving animals off the plate, it can shift things inside and in our sense of connection with nature and with other sentient beings and with maybe something beyond ourselves, something bigger.
Mm. Wonderful. Yeah, all amazing points and places to go with veganism. There's so many, I've been saying this lately, that there's so many different veganisms,
Mm.
and that there's ethical vegans and philosophical vegans and spiritual vegans. There's lots of different ways to be vegan, and they all interconnect. And I think you've really touched on so many different aspects here in this book. And I guess it's maybe fair to say that this is structured like a self-help book. But instead of focusing on only like helping oneself, it's about how when you make changes that are good for yourself, then it's also good for others and good for the world and good for animals, right? So how that kind of interconnects. So it kind of takes self-help and radiates it out, connecting it to the world, right? Do you think that's a fair assessment? Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it because I think that's ultimately what I was trying to communicate. And I think on my own journey, I've discovered this earlier in life. There were times when life felt stressful and, you're just trying to survive. Sometimes we, think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and sometimes we're in the lower stages of that hierarchy of trying to just simply manage life, manage our emotions, manage safety or physical needs or connection needs, all these things. But I think as many of us grow and explore our life more, we find that the deepest meaning comes when what we're doing also helps others or helps causes that we care about. And that was a shift that seemed to come through in my interviews with vegans, that there's this realization of interconnectedness that I had just mentioned to you, and that so many of the things I just listed that came through as core themes in this research, like the values and purpose and compassion, they're all ways that when we deepen into these, it helps our own psychological and emotional well-being. They're things that positive psychology has found are aligned with greater mental health and greater well-being and flourishing. And yet they're also values and behaviors that can help the greater good in some way. And so I've come to see how it's all so interconnected, and veganism is one way that we can care for ourselves in many powerful ways, and that ripples out to help things that we care about. And I've come to see it as both and that, we need to care for our own well-being. As vegans, sometimes we can be very compassionate for animals and not so compassionate for ourselves. And so I feel that vegans need to include themselves in their circle of compassion.
Yeah.
And then others of us need to expand our compassion to go beyond where we've compartmentalized it to only a few select species or a few select groups of people. So I feel that it's these ripples or circles of compassion that include ourselves and ripple out to more and more beings beyond us.
Yeah. Yeah, talk more about that, including ourselves in our circle of compassion. I think that that's really interesting and important. I see a lot of people, especially when they first get into activism or vegan, even when they become vegan, they get active, they're excited, they want to, share it with the world, and they maybe start volunteering or something like that. And they can often get overwhelmed and burnt out and upset that it's hard to be vegan in a non-vegan world, and you don't realize that at first, and then it starts closing in that, oh well, my family doesn't really care, and oh, I'm just bombarded with all of this animal cruelty that I now realize, like, I now my eyes are open to it. That can be so hard on us, and I think a lot of people burn out and even just go back to, eating regularly just because they can't handle it. It's very difficult. So, do you want to talk a little more about that, about how we do need to include ourselves in that circle of compassion? I like how you said that.
Yeah, that is very important. As a psychologist who previously worked as a psychotherapist, I've had to work on this in myself as well as support clients. And now in my work as a vegan educator, I see how important it is on so many levels. those of us that are empathic and those of us are trying to help others, and I think maybe particularly with helping animals, we feel so much compassion and such conviction and want to help. And like you, I've seen many vegans feel that, I've got to help the animals and I can't care about my own needs because, their needs are so great. And there's truth to that. And yet the reality is we as humans have limits. We have a nervous system that reacts in certain ways to certain things. We have physical and emotional needs too. And if we're not in tune with those or caring for those, we do burn out and we aren't going to be as effective. So it becomes really important to step back and notice the feelings, that we may be having. And when the signs that we're overwhelmed or burning out or our physical nervous system is just on overdrive, and having some tools to manage that and to navigate that. I do talk a bit about that in chapter 10, one of the last chapters of the book, where I really get into how do we navigate some of these emotional challenges and include self-care as part of that. So there's certainly a lot of things that we can do to take better care of ourselves. Would you like me to share a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. I'd love to. I mean, we often think of self-care as like, going for a spa day or a bubble bath or whatever. But it can be so much. It can be so many things. And yeah, so yeah, please tell us a little more about that.
Yes, and yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, those things can be helpful, the spa and the bubble bath, but yes, you're right, it's so much more. I think part of it is this mindset that we are interconnected. So caring for ourselves does matter in this equation. We want to be effective. We want to help, and so our own well-being does matter. So realizing we are interconnected, and so that means caring for ourselves too. And so it can be having practices in place that help you to have a balanced life. Because what can happen is if we're so into activism that we don't keep some balance in our lives, we can get what Dr. Melanie Joy talks about this a bit in her book, Beyond Beliefs, which is about communication for vegans. She talks about how we can get into sort of a trauma mindset where we're seeing the world in the lens of everybody's either a hero, a victim, or a perpetrator. And we don't really see the shades of gray. And we just feel like so responsible that we need to fix everything,
Yeah.
where the reality is we don't have that much power. It doesn't mean we don't have any power. And so it's like learning to recognize where we have control and where we don't,
Yeah.
and having some balance in our life where we get time in nature or time with our beloved companion animals, time to renew. That can look different for different people, what that will look like. But we do need time where our nervous system is calmed. And so that could be some of the practices that I just mentioned. It could be meditation. It certainly can be just having fun sometimes, even though we feel guilty sometimes having fun. It's almost a requirement that we need some of that to balance out our brain and our body.
Mm.
And then we also need tools for when we do get activated for how to self-regulate and self-calm. It's not about shutting feelings down, but being able to acknowledge our feelings, work through them, see where they're guiding us, come to more aligned steps that we can take rather than just acting out of anger or agitation, but rather being able to work through those feelings and then come to wise actions that can empower us and what we care about.
Talking about the psychological perspective, you mentioned in the book about the violence of eating animals and how that can affect us, and how, this very unkind and violent act of confining and killing animals affects our psyche on an individual level and as a community. I'd love to explore that. I think it's interesting. I don't know that I mean, we think about it. I think as vegans, we certainly think about it, but we don't think about it like as a community, how it would affect the community. And I think that violence in any form that is, kind of normalized in a society can certainly affect our collective psyche.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I agree that it's not really talked about much other than those of us who are looking a little deeper at these issues.
Yeah.
But I think it can start with, we talked about the workers in slaughterhouses. We know that those who do that kind of work, and especially those that are in the more direct killing parts of that work, the more violent parts of that work, they themselves often have higher rates of domestic violence in their homes and substance abuse. So we know that someone is doing that work on our behalf, those that eat meat. And those people that are doing that work often, there is a toll on them
Mm.
in terms of their own lives. And so then on top of that, we might be a little bit removed from that because most of us are not working in those settings, but there's definitely links between how humans treat animals and how they treat other humans. And so we often can feel a little bit disconnected from the violence in our food system, but at some subconscious level, I think most of us have some awareness of that. That probably affects us in ways we may not always be, conscious of.
Yeah.
I think there's a desensitization that happens in our society, especially with so much violence just normalized through so much of what's in the media.
Yeah.
And yet I think it must have an effect, whether we can measure that right now or not. But we're in a sense eating stress and trauma, that the animals are experiencing, and probably the workers when we eat animal foods.
Yeah.
So I
Mm.
think to continue doing it, we really have to compartmentalize big parts of ourselves, and we don't realize that until we make the shift to deciding not to eat that way anymore or live that way anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, I think it's really something that needs to be talked about more. I mean, we talk about systematic violence with war and occupations and things like that, which absolutely is critical to talk about and be aware of. But I see it also with farming of animals and how they're treated. It's systematic violence as well that we are part of and perpetrating. It's oof, intense stuff. But that's one of the beautiful things about going vegan is that we kind of remove ourselves from that violence, right? We actively are boycotting that system of violence. So veganism kind of disrupts that systematic violence against animals. And I know a lot of people feel like, oh, I'm just one person. What can I do? What does my going vegan matter or whatever? But even on your psyche, it matters.
Mhm.
And I think it matters as well physically to not buy those products because that is, voting for vegan food and not supporting the industry, on an actual physical level at the grocery store and the restaurant. But there's also that added benefit of our psyche being separated from that violence, knowing that we are not perpetrating that violence anymore. I think it's just got to be good for us.
Yes, I would agree with that. As you were speaking, I really resonated with what you were saying. And I was thinking that I think that breaking free of that destructive, violent system is part of the peace that people were describing to me, vegans were describing to me that they are experiencing. And I know it's part of the peace that I experience. It's sort of like at some level, I must have known the system was violent and harmful, and yet I felt that I had to eat meat at one point in my life, or
Yeah.
I believed that. And so to break free of that and realize, no, I don't. And, and not only can I not eat it, I can thrive as well.
Yeah.
There's something very freeing in that. We can feel good that we are making some difference in taking this stand, and that we do have ripple effects on people around us. People can see that it's possible, whether they take action right away, maybe not, but showing people what is possible by our living it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Angela, I wanted to ask you about chapter 10. We mentioned it before about kind of the emotional challenges, but you also talk about the social challenges that some people face when going vegan or having been vegan. I'd love to talk about that because, that can be something really hard for people to navigate, especially when they're first going vegan, is kind of the connections they have, their community, and the social stuff. So can you talk about some of the difficulties and maybe recommendations to ease those difficulties?
Definitely. I think that it is an often overlooked challenge that is so big for many people. I think we overlook how important our social connections are, that we're wired to bond with others. And in fact, research shows that lack of social connection can be as detrimental to our health and emotional well-being as many other things like cigarette smoking, for example, and obesity and not exercising. Our
Wow.
physical health can be as affected by not having social support
Hmm.
as those other things. So just to realize it is super important. So when people go vegan and they now need to eat differently than those around them to handle family and holiday gatherings that might have centered around animal products, and they have to speak up to grandma or mom or dad or others in their life. That can be challenging and more so for certain people than others, but just to recognize it is huge and it is social challenges are the biggest reason why sometimes people stray away from veganism when they had first started on this journey. So just recognizing that it can be a big challenge. It doesn't mean it's not something we can't overcome. We can learn different ways to handle it, but just we need to recognize that for some people it can be a really big obstacle at first. So learning ways to handle it is so important. So I think, one factor for many people is to be proactive and prepared. When I first became vegan, the first couple of events I went to, I just showed up having not yet told anyone I was vegan, and they just didn't go very well. There either wasn't food to eat or I wasn't sure how to handle the situation. I learned it was much better when I either brought food or I spoke ahead of time to the host or I checked ahead of time about a restaurant. Just being proactive and prepared is huge.
Yeah.
And then having good communication skills. Recognizing we can share this in a way where people can be curious to learn more about it versus us either lecturing to them or criticizing them for their choices. We can share why we've become vegan, especially early on, so that they can be curious about this path that we're on, and it might lead to them to be curious about it for themselves, but not expecting right away that everyone around us is going to change. Maybe at first we might invite them to be an ally on our journey and over time share more. We may also need to set things up in our household if we have people in our household who are not vegan, so that we figure out how we're going to handle meals and where food is stored and different things like that that can make it more workable. So I think communication skills and being proactive are huge. And then also finding your own vegan supports is important, because if you have other people on the same journey, it can give you a lot of insights on how to handle the challenges that come up and help you feel not so alone.
Yeah, no, that's all good advice. And we don't have to convince everyone. And I think that's something that we often feel as vegans. We feel this sense of urgency, like, oh, the animals are suffering. I have to tell everyone, everyone around me needs to go vegan. And yeah, we want everyone to go vegan. I don't mean that we don't want that, but sometimes we come at it from this place of like, I've got to tell everybody. Pace yourself. Realize that not everyone is going to be as excited about it as you are, and we learn this with family. Oftentimes the first people we go to, the first people we want to convince, are family, and we're shocked and surprised that these very caring, loving people that we associate with all the time don't care about this thing that seems incredibly important to us. So this is what I often advise. Talk to people who want to hear it. Find people that want to hear about it, that want to have a conversation about it. Great advice that you said, to kind of come at it like, well, this is why I'm doing it, and this is why it's important to me, instead of making it about them. Make it about yourself. But then also, realizing that we don't need everyone. We just need those early adopters, the certain percentage of people that are as excited about it as we are, to create that critical mass, right? That's going to bring us
Yeah.
over the finish line. So not feeling like you have to be on every moment and that you have to, have a vegan message for every situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 And that's beautifully put. I think that what you said is exactly right. People are in different, if you think of the psychological stages of change, people are in different stages of readiness for this message. And so if we're putting all our energy in trying to push people who are not in a stage of openness or readiness, it can be exhausting and frustrating. Whereas, as
Yeah.
you're saying, there are people further along that continuum of readiness and openness, and they may really benefit and resonate. And the ones that aren't ready, it might take a lot of seeds planted before they are a little bit more open or curious. So just knowing that that can take time.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
No,
wish it was yesterday, but the reality is that, you've been vegan a while, you discover that it doesn't always just happen the way we want it to or as quickly as we want it to.
yeah, I like that states of readiness. It's true. People that are more open than not, and we have to kind of find those windows where people are open, have a window open. Yeah.
Exactly. And also, in addition to sharing our own story and our own journey where they can be curious, then if they are curious, well, then you can shift to more, well, what interests them and being able to answer questions or share information that resonates with their interest and their openness.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, I'm wanting to ask, I know we need to wrap up soon, but I really want to ask about the last chapter and the spiritual connection. I'm of course a spiritual person. I'm right now, my husband and I are really exploring veganism as a spiritual journey, as a spiritual expression, and those connections. And I find that even vegans that don't feel that they are spiritual, that they don't resonate with spirituality at all, still have what I think are elements of spiritual expression or spirituality, like you talked about in the beginning when that interconnection with the world and, being nonviolent, things like that, that I feel are spiritual. And so there's this interesting parallel with spirituality and veganism. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was one of the more unexpected parts of my research. How many people said on their own different ways that veganism related to what I would call spiritual concepts in their life, even if, as you're saying, they didn't identify as spiritual.
Yeah.
One person said, I feel more spiritual now that I don't have to take a life to live a life. I feel that I'm connected to my higher self and all living beings.
Mm.
There was a lot of comments that were along those lines, and also some people feeling they were more connected to intuition and that they felt lighter and clearer once they were no longer consuming animals.
Yeah.
And so it came through in these interviews and surveys. And in some ways, it's the hardest part to try to describe or talk about. But in the chapter, I do my best to share some of the ways that it came through in my conversations and surveys with vegans. And I guess I related it to some of what you shared. One, that being vegan and not eating animals and trying to not cause harm to animals to whatever degree we can is very much an expression of many common spiritual, ethical, and moral values that we hold.
Mm-hmm.
So some people said compassion is my religion. Others were more spiritual or identified as more spiritual, and veganism just fit with what they'd already believed and already the values they already espoused. But there definitely was a big connection there. And I found it interesting because I do certainly know a lot of spiritual people who are not vegan. And I just wonder how we can invite and encourage people to see those interconnections between vegan values and our spiritual values.
Yeah, I love all that. I think that's really interesting. And I've experienced that too, where people, had no interest in spirituality, but then they go vegan and it somehow opens something up, right? Very cool. Well, Angela, I've really, really enjoyed talking to you, and I am going to ask you our last question. What gives you hope for the future?
Sometimes it's challenging, but I try to every day envision the world that I want to see. It's not that I have a clear picture of it, but I know that that vision of the world that I want to see is one of compassion for all sentient beings and a world that can flourish and where we're living aligned with our truer values. So I've tried to envision that world, and I think of a mantra about that's a Sanskrit mantra about, wanting to see a world where all beings can flourish and be happy and free. And then considering what is my part in that? How do my words and actions contribute to creating that world of peace and compassion for all living beings? And I think alongside that, what helps is seeing the amazing other vegans that I've met and amazing people in the world who are working for a more compassionate and healthy and sustainable world.
Well, your book gives me hope. I love this book. It's really wonderful. The Vegan Transformation, A Journey to Heal Yourself and the World. I encourage everyone to check it out. And Angela, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you for all your wonderful work. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was such a wonderful conversation to have. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. As humans, as really any sentient animal, our mental state is really precarious. And lately, I've had numerous vegans and activist friends confide in me that they're struggling with social anxiety, depression from our political situation. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself. I certainly don't want to give mental health advice, but something that helps me is thinking about a Sanskrit word, a concept, samtosha. It means contentment. And sometimes when we're having these mental struggles and all of this stuff that is just really, really hard, finding joy and happiness, that's just too hard. Like I can't go there. So I think about samtosha and just being content in whatever situation I'm in whatever life throws at me. Maybe I can't find joy in the moment, but at least trying to cultivate contentment. And that isn't complacency. We want to strive to do better, but it helps me to be in the moment without anxiety, trying to be in the moment without frustration, bringing in contentment. I like how Angela said that we have to include ourselves in our circle of compassion, right? And sometimes it's hard to know what to do to quiet those demons and to quiet all those thoughts. But just know that you are one of the rare humans on earth who are guided by compassion and love. And that can be the source of struggle, but it can also be the comfort that we find in living, the contentment in knowing that we are doing what we can in this moment and not contributing to the suffering of the world. So be kind to yourself and live vegan.